Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming to the last session. I know this is the point in the Congress where everyone wants to have those last conversations with the people that they've met. So really appreciate you coming and listening to our panel. I'm very pleased to facilitate these four incredible leaders who have spent their careers building organizations and helping build partners and the communities in which they work. This session was designed to be at the end of the Congress because over the course of the last couple of days, we have talked about the ingredients of partnership, the importance, we've talked about some of the tools and the skills, and this session now is having the opportunity to talk to people who have kind of been there, done that. They're going to talk to us about their histories and the work that they've done to raise and increase the impact of their organizations. It's a rare opportunity, I think, to have this intimate space with people who have done some incredible things. And so I partly herded you to the front of the room so that we can actually have a conversation. We're going to try to keep this pretty flexible. We have some questions and some opportunity to hear from them, but we also want to hear from you. So as you are listening, if questions are coming to you, I want you to feel free to actually put up your hand, even if we're in the middle of a session, because we would like it to be a bit of a dynamic conversation, especially because after 2 days, we're all good friends. So let's get into that. Maybe I will just go over. So this panel, in case you don't know where you are, is calling for more countries to do more faster and to safeguard nature. And we're going to be hearing from the organizations who have taken some big steps and helped to grow. But we're going to hear about what scared them when they were doing it, what they worried about, what they still worry about as they see a change in conservation environment. And so we're going to start with Angelo. I'm not going to read bios. They are all in your packages. But why don't we just start? Angelo, you were the head of the LIFE program in the EU. So maybe start by giving us a bit of a summary of that program and your role in it.
So the first thing is that I have a disclaimer. 2 years ago, I could have spoken about LIFE as a representative of the EU. Nowadays, I represent only myself because I retired. And it's not a bad situation, I must admit. Nevertheless, I've been spending 29 years of my professional life managing the LIFE program, so that's probably why they invited me to talk about it. So the LIFE program is the spearhead program for environment of the EU. It has been adopted the 21st of May around the lunchtime of 1992. I was not there yet at the time. I arrived only 2 years later. And LIFE obviously is the result of all the international agreements, discussions, Rio and so on. So the timing was perfect. And LIFE was designed at the time to serve two purposes mainly. The first one was protecting nature. We were still not talking about biodiversity in the jargon. It was really nature conservation, punto. And then the second one was all the rest of the environment that you can think of. Noise, chemicals, water, whatever. So all the rest of the environmental aspects. LIFE has been in place now for more than 30 years. It's a scheme whereby projects are financed through grants. Grants that represents only a share of the cost, so it's just a co-financing. And we have accumulated probably more than 6,000 projects so far. So I'll give you the idea of the growth rate over time of LIFE. As you can see in the first edition, we're talking about 400 million euros. At the time, it was still called ECU. And then it went on cycle by cycle. And the last one we are currently living through, which ends in 2027, is 5.4 billion euros. So if you want, we are talking about scale up. This is just a very simple example of scaling up in terms of finances. The beauty of LIFE, for what it concerns us is that it has evolved over time, but the nature component has remained across all the 30 and more years. Like tiny little bricks, one after the other, those projects, they have built a huge foundation, which is probably better expressed than in many words with this picture. This is not a disease, this is Natura 2000. This is the largest network of protected areas still, as far as I know, in the world. And it is a design that the European Union has adopted many, many years ago. We're talking about the first piece of legislation from which Natura 2000 derives. It's 1979, and the second one, 1992. We're talking about 18% of the EU territory, land surface, and almost 10% of the seas, 28,000 sites, from very small ones to very large ones. And everybody agrees that Natura 2000 would not be the way it is if the LIFE program would have not been there. So that small amount of money that you've seen, and later on we can talk about it in the more scaling up discussion, has been incredibly instrumental to develop probably one of the biggest achievements worldwide so far in terms of nature conservation. So this is what LIFE is about. And the last thing is that one of my former directors defined LIFE as the people's program. At the beginning I said, why the people's program? But in reality it was right, because it's one of the few programs of the EU, apart from Erasmus, that certainly some of you know, where we have exchange of students, and in that case it really gets in the living room of the families. LIFE is the one that gets as close as possible to people on the ground, with very small groups of people, shepherds, farmers involved in LIFE projects. So it is indeed a people's program, and it was designed to serve the people in a totally flexible bottom-up approach. So the mechanics of LIFE is you have a dream in your drawer, you open it, you see whether it more or less fits the scope of this program, and it's very likely that you can design your project the way you want, the size you want, the length you want, in order to achieve the results that you want to achieve, and not the other way around, which is also fundamental for the success of this program.
So when we talk about scaling up, we normally in these kind of congresses talk about scaling up NGO groups or community groups. In your case, though, it was a scaling of a public program. So tell us, how's that any different, or what did you need to do to enable the scaling of a public program?
Yeah, so the first thing is that I would like to dismiss a myth. We as citizens, we tend to believe that since roads are there, the administration of roads has always been there. Since hospitals are there, same thing. And the same happens, let's say, in a situation like environmental policy or the role of a financial program like LIFE. In reality, scaling up and growth happens in public administration, growth or degrowth, or disappearance in sometimes, and reappearance, happens just the same way. The only issue is that you work in a different context. So it's a very highly regulated context, super political if you want. So some of the key elements for scaling up in a scheme like LIFE, they tend to be as smart and opportunity-driven as for the private sector, but they are more of another kind. I give you an example. I always like to use anecdotes more than long, big theories. When I arrived in '94, we were coming close to the end of the first round of LIFE. So there was already discussion, should we have another program like LIFE or not? And I immediately fell in love with this particular program. So with another couple of colleagues and Anton Gazemek, who is in the other room, we took a train and we went to Strasbourg. Strasbourg is the seat of the European Parliament. And we met a number of MEPs, member of the European Parliament, something that you should not do because an official of the Commission should not go to the political level and lobby them, if you want. We did it. I remember yesterday, I think one of our chiefs that was rewarded said that you should walk even beyond the legal context or legislation. You should have the courage to do things which are, I wouldn't say illegal, but they stay in a gray zone. And so this is the first lesson that I learned. Even though you are within a public administration, very codified behavior, loyalty, all these kind of elements, every now and then be unloyal. Because you are paid in reality, in that particular situation, you are paid to serve another owner of the company, which is not your boss, it's the citizens. In our case, it's the citizens of the European Union. So this is the first lesson. Obviously, not everything works in that way. The other thing is that you have to be smart in using the money. Obviously, this can happen if the regulator has left you a certain degree of freedom. In the 90s, procedures in the European Commission were, just as in many other administrations, much freer and flexible as compared to today. So what did we do, for example? You see here Natura 2000. What do you do? The first thing, if you want to design a network, you map. You try to identify the areas which are valuable for the network. So what did we do? Instead of financing classical conservation action, so people going underground and restoring, we financed databases, mapping, investigation. So huge projects at national level, Italy, Spain, Ireland, just name the countries, mapped all their countries to identify the areas which should have been in the Natura 2000 network later on. First big step. We get the lists from the member states. Now, what's the next step? Once an area is in the network, you have to design something that allows you to understand how to plan your activity of management, restoration, and so on, management plans. We started financing thousands of management plans. Then the next step comes and you have to start really restoring, so implementing the management plan. So one by one, we used the various articles in the regulation saying, what are we missing for this particular article? So this leads, if you're smart enough, so if you manage to link the policy or the regulation, if you want, with your money, if you manage to link it well, leads you to be more, how can I say, believable, more trustful, more impactful. And since the regulator is the one that decides on your persistence and on your scale up, you have arguments later on to see, you see, I've used the money that you have given me better than what you might even expect. Now give me more money. So this is one of the other lessons I learned. And then the next...
Well, maybe what I'll do is, maybe I'll turn to Fred and maybe give us a little bit about you and your background and your organization, and then, to Fred, and actually it might be Greg's slides next. And then I have a whole number of questions, but I think I'm going to ask the whole panel them rather than go one by one. And so, yeah, why don't we go ahead, Fred, and just tell us a little bit about your organization and your role in it.
Sure, thank you. Hopefully the images will naturally rotate of their own volition. Morning, everyone. Great to be here. So my name is Fred Nelson. I live just across the border in Vermont. But most of my career for the past 25 years has centered on conservation in Africa. Maliasili means natural resources in Swahili. The first half of my career, about 11 years or so, I spent living and working in northern Tanzania. And kind of the core of my experience there, and which has informed Maliasili's work and everything that I've done, is around trying to develop community-based solutions to conservation that's based on local economic, social, cultural interests in wildlife, obviously some of the most spectacular wildlife populations and landscapes in the world in East Africa. And in working in, and I should say at the scale of Africa, when we're talking about land conservation, I know there have been a few, maybe one or two other African conservation presentations, such as my colleague Maxie Lewis from Namibia. We're talking about a regional context where about 90% of the land is communal, right? And so by communal means it's subject to customary, often traditional forms of tenure and communal governance institutions. So small-scale fisheries, forests, rangelands where most savanna wildlife populations live are and these are the foundations for livelihoods, such as traditional communal pastoralism, which again is based on communal management of rangelands, often seasonal movement of livestock, which is not to say that it's subsistence. I mean, communal management of rangelands, individual ownership of livestock by traditional pastoralist communities like the Maasai, who live in Kenya and Tanzania, and who I've worked with for many years. I mean, that's a lot of commercial, highly entrepreneurial forms of livestock production and sale. But really, we're talking about communal governance context and a regional context where individual lands are, with the exception of a few southern African countries, basically less than 10% of the land. So really, conservation in Africa depends on community-led conservation. There are significant protected area networks. But again, with a lot of the things that are being discussed at this conference in terms of how can conservation succeed at the landscape scale, how can conservation deliver impact at scale, 30 by 30, there is a tremendous focus and importance on community-driven solutions, making conservation work for the people who are living on the land and really managing land communally. And African countries like Namibia and Tanzania and Kenya have really been pioneers in community-based approaches and models of conservancies. And that's a lot of the work that I've been involved with and that Mali Asili supports. So Mali Asili as an organization, our starting point was a recognition that in that context, the really critical agents of change, the individuals and organizations that are developing community-based models, that are trying to get conservation to work for people on the ground, are often grassroots organizations. They're local. They are locally rooted, as is the case with conservation, throughout the world. It's place-based, it's community-based, driven by local or indigenous communities and their connections and their interests in their lands and in benefiting from their resources and improving their livelihoods through the rich natural resources that they depend on. And in that context, though, those organizations, they, when you see, often you'll see a, let's say, it could be a scientist, it could be a group of community activists. You create an organization, you start to maybe become successful, you attract a bit of resources, and then you're running a business, right? You're building an organization. And our realization, or mine kind of earlier in my career, was that, figuring out how to build that organization is a lot of the challenge in conservation, right? And so you can have organizations that are driving key solutions, but actually how to secure the resources, how to develop their strategies, how to become successful as an organization is often the key barrier that local organizations have to overcome. And so what Mali Asili does is we basically support those kind of African community conservation, ecosystem restoration champions. We work through a long-term partnership model and a portfolio of organizations now working across with more than 50 organizations in about 16 countries. And our focus is really to grow and strengthen local conservation organizations, kind of the best of the best in African community-led conservation, and help them build organizations that can actually grow their work, take it to scale, whatever scale means in their context, and it means different things to different organizations and different types of organizations. But we really focus on that organizational element. And I think in the African context, local and grassroots organizations face particular challenges because a lot of the funding comes from the north, and it comes from funders and sources that they face language and cultural barriers in terms of accessing. So resources, strategy, communications, building strong teams, those are the kinds of fundamentals that locally led conservation efforts in Africa really need to be successful, and that's where Mali Asili focuses our efforts.
That's excellent, thank you. I think we'll turn to Catherine. Tell us a little bit about, well, you've heard about the NCC, so we probably won't go into too much about us again. But maybe, Catherine, tell us a little bit about maybe your experience with growing organizations and scaling, and then we'll come back to some other detailed questions for you.
Excellent. So great to see everyone. Catherine Grenier, President and CEO of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I've been with NCC for over 4 years now. Before NCC, I was the head of Quebec provincial or national park system. And before that, over a decade with Parks Canada. So for me, joining the not-for-profit sector was a true choice because I felt it was a time where innovation, collaboration, and scaling up was what the world essentially needed. And you've heard about us at NCC. Essentially, we're solution finders. We're looking for resiliency at the landscape level. That means results at scale. And we're doing that through expanded collaborations and allyship with Indigenous communities. And for us really to get to that resiliency, it's about increasing the scope and scale of the work that we do. So about 4 years ago, we embarked on this bold plan to double our impact. Essentially, NCC has been a very successful organization for over 60 years. And the idea is, how do we build on that success to reach new heights? And how do we, between now and 2030, at the time where the world needs us the more, how do we double our impact? And one of the questions that Lisa was asking was, how do you know it's the right time? How do you know it's the right time to scale up, right? And I think we could all agree in this room, we've heard it many times, we all feel the call to action. We all know that the great work that this community's done for many, many years is awesome, but it's nowhere near enough. Like, we're barely slowing the loss. And we don't really like the losing bit, right? I think we got to get on the winning side, and that's really what drives us at NCC. And if you think about it through kind of intellectually, there's big external driver. Angelo was saying it's opportunity driven. Well, 100%. Right? If we're looking at the global, the domestic policy context, we need to do it. There's a space. We don't need to debate whether there's a crisis and whether this community need to do more. There's market opportunity, there's social opportunity. So that's a huge part of why we felt it was the right time. But you also need to know if internally as an organization you can do it. It's one thing to see the opportunity, but how do you seize it? For us, there were key enabling conditions. It really needs to be built in your strategy. It needs to be built in your purpose. Essentially, how do you align with the need to scale? So for us, we built that strategy and that purpose to align where the growth need. We also had a very solid organization foundation. And I'm seeing my predecessor in this room, so I want to say a big thank you for the work that John has done for 24 years with the organization before I had the honor to join. But a solid organizational foundation is key. And what does this mean? It's great governance. It's a very supportive and aligned board. That's key, right? Like, who's on your board? Where does your board want to go? Then it's about culture. Do you have the right culture to go where you need to go? Do you have the know-how? Do you have the reputation? Do you have the credibility? And these aren't things you build overnight. These are things that are built over the long run. And I would say they are the key ingredients that you need to have in order to step up. Another really important piece, and this has been a key theme of the conference, is partnership. Like, you need those trusted partnerships, but you need to align with people that share your ambition. You rise together. You're gonna rise as high as your partners. So you need to nurture the current relationship, but you also need to seek out and find new ones in spaces where you've probably never been, in spaces where it's actually quite uncomfortable and potentially scary. And I think that's really how you're able to scale up, because at the end of the day, nobody grows alone. It's about scaling up the whole sector and not leaving anybody behind in the journey. But that's all kind of the brain work. That's the smart word. That's what you would write. But one of the message I wanted to also share is, beyond all this, if we go back to the real question, when is the right time? Well, there's no real answer. It's about courage. And it's about a bit of that leap of faith and stepping into that zone where you're not sure, where a lot of people tell you, nah, I can't do this. It's too much. Are you sure? Do you have the data? How can you prove this? And that's the space where I think from a leadership perspective, you got to be willing to step in. And in my experience with various organizations, it usually it needs leadership for that. You have great teams, and your teams will always see the risk, the limits, the capacity of where they've been, the path we've already traveled, and how do you get to take that bigger step, which unlocks the full potential? I think that's a bit of that scary space, right? And it does take a bit of that opportunity mindset. So how do you make sure you're driven by the opportunities that you see smartly, but as opposed to being limited by your fears? Because they're there and they'll always be there. And I think it's a constant struggle. But I think we all need to take that big step.
You can see why I like working for her. So Greg, I could see that you were nodding there. Some of that resonated with you.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and background?
Yeah, sure. I'd like to begin by saying that your presence in the room today and your presence at this conference demonstrates that we all understand the most important principle of scaling up, which is to scale up, you need to reach out. That's the fundamental thing that we now know. We have to build our community of conservationists at the local, provincial, state, federal, and global level. I was nodding when Catherine was speaking because I was reminded of a quote of Nelson Mandela that you've probably all heard. It seems impossible until it's done. And that's something we always have to hold in our mind and our heart to give us the courage to keep going against odds that sometimes seem absolutely insurmountable. So that's just one thought. I've had the honor in working in a number of partnership environments at the local, national, and international level, and I'm just going to quickly go through them and talk a little bit about the scaling up that occurred and the principles that allowed that scaling up to occur, because all of these scale-ups fundamentally depended on partnerships. The first one actually took 25 years of my life. I founded the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy in San Francisco. I was the first employee, and in 25 years we scaled up to 225,000 volunteers annually, producing 500,000 hours of volunteer time, $800 million of funds given to park projects and programs. That leveraged $1.5 billion in public and philanthropic investment and restored landscapes and historic landmarks all around the San Francisco Bay Area, and ended up with when I left, with a staff of 450 people. So it was quite the ride. The fundamental success factor was really public-private partnerships, but community engagement had to fuel those partnerships to make them authentic. And we were lucky to be able to tap into many diverse funding sources, including earned and philanthropic and public income, that put the whole pie together. The second example, I'm on the board of the Conservation Lands Foundation. This organization is a little over 10 years old. It protects public lands throughout mainly the western United States. In its short time, it's scaled up to 10 million acres saved. It's advanced many indigenous-led conservation efforts, and it's purposely formed a network of 85 grassroots organizations to give us the community-driven conservation and the political advocacy at the local level to affect decision makers at the federal level. So the key factors to success there were moving from local advocacy to federal action, bringing in the philanthropic and political support, and using a unique tool in America, a good one, that the President of the United States can, by executive order, save land. And we got 2 presidents to save 1 million, 1 million, 1 million, and another million by executive order. And then the other president took them away and we had to put them back. But anyway, then I've been, who was that? I guess. Then I've been really lucky to work in Canada. What an honor that is to be part of this country and the people and the places. My role has been with the British Columbia Parks Foundation, who saw my work at Golden Gate as relevant to where they were going as an organization. In their short time frame, you saw Andy this morning, they've protected 55 places, 90,000 acres, raised over $400 million, created a conservation fund to achieve 30-30, but also very importantly, they're mobilizing the people of British Columbia to speak to what they inherently believe, that nature is part of their identity. Their success factors are really effective and powerful branding and communications, strong early results that gave people confidence in them, and then the philanthropic and government partnerships and resources leveraging one another. Then I turned to something dear to my heart, and there's someone in this room who is very dear to my heart, Eugenio Rengifo. I met Eugenio, sponsored by Lincoln, by the way, when he was the first executive director of Amigos de los Parques, or Friends of the Parks, and I was asked to go on that journey with him. And it was part of Tompkins' conservation effort in Patagonia, which many of you have heard of. And that effort has been, over a 30-year period, 17 national parks, 14 million acres protected, 1,700 miles of land. And Eugenio's role was really to build that grassroots commitment to those actions. So the key factors in success there were a bold vision, bold leadership, significant philanthropy, and with that philanthropy, political access and influence. So when I think about scaling up, I think about like the 4 R's. It's about reputation, who you are and what you stand for. It's about resources that fuel that reputation. It's about resources that produce result, and it's about relationships. All these ingredients are essential to a scaling up mindset and to getting to where you want to go. You've probably heard this quote many times: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna warn you now. I'm gonna look to you soon for your questions, so begin forming them. But for the panel, you've all used the words scaling up. You've used the words increasing impact and growth. Are those all synonyms? Is scaling up and growing the same thing? Okay, Catherine, yeah. Do you want to pass that down?
In my view, I would say no. And I think we've all purposefully talked about scaling up. In our world, it's about impact. And some of us, in order to be most impactful, we need to be very precise, very small in our niche, so we can empower and make others successful. In some other area, you need to increase, as I said, for NCC, it's about increasing the scope and scale. So we need to work with many, many more people to maximize our impact. But at the end of the day, it's not about the growth of one organization. It's about how together can we have that impact for nature. I'm sure others want to add to that.
Yeah, I think scaling usually involves growth, but is not the same as growth, right? And it's useful to think about kind of your linear growth curve and your exponential growth curve too, right? Ultimately, scaling and kind of the transformation, the scale of systems change that we're seeking in the world, whether we're talking about, energy transitions, whenever we're talking about energy transitions, we're talking about how do you achieve that exponential curve that gets you to the scale of systems change and how we use energy in the world. And, similarly, when we think about conservation impact, how do we drive that curve towards that exponential scale? I do also think, as we're thinking about scaling, it's important to emphasize, in relation to that point around impact, you want to scale down before you scale up. And I think that's often the mistake that we make in saying, okay, to scale up, we're going to do more, right? And often in conservation, scaling means doing lots more stuff in practice, which is not necessarily helpful. What we really need to scale up is what is that core unit of impact for every organization, for every initiative? What is it that you're trying to achieve? What delivers the greatest impact in relation to the amount of resources that go into that conservation intervention in relation to a particular need, or a particular context? So getting clear around impact and being clear around, well, this is what we're trying to scale. This is our unit of impact. These are the key components that allow us to deliver that. So being clear about your design of your conservation work. If we do this, it will result in this. Okay, now we have a product. We know what the impact is. We know how much it costs. Now we can scale that up and deliver the kind of transformation that we're seeking.
I'll say something that will seem contrary to the title of this session, but I have seen organizations in an effort to scale up have lost their impact because they were overreaching in their mission, got too broadly spread, and unfortunately lost what they were doing so effectively if they had just stayed at the level that they were working. So there is an urgency to scale up, but in the process of doing that, we don't want to lose those very effective people that are working really efficiently at the mission that they have, and where scaling up is not realistic for them.
And maybe I'll add to that. As we were talking as a panel, we were talking about personal fear when we're looking at growth, and that's one of them, right? As you're growing and scaling, growing means change, and growing means you have to evolve your organization, you have to adapt to scale, but you don't want to lose what's good, what made you good in the first place. So when I'm thinking of an organization like NCC, two things are always front of mind for me. The first one is we have to become more sophisticated. That means more process, that means more people, that means more expertise, that means leveraging science and data, more structure. But how do you do that without losing nimbleness and agility, which made us successful in the first place? So it's always that trading off, making sure that some of the gains you're seeing aren't outweighing some of the consequences, or outweighing the consequences you could imagine. Another one is, and it was part of your 4 Rs, and I love that slide. I will reuse it. I'm a big stealer in general. I've built my career on it. I love good ideas. But it's a relationship. You know, as an organization, especially in the not-for-profit sector, we're all built on relationship. And as we grow, how do we keep these relationships just as strong, just as authentic, right? And you're going from a relationship of person to person to a relationship through someone else, and then the relationship through someone else, and then you get the point, right? Until it's 10 levels. How do you make sure that the values and the culture of your organization transpire everything you do, right? If you're a team of 50, Fred was asking me, how many times does NCC get together as one organization? Well, it's been over 5 years. It was pre-pandemic when we were half the size of who we are right now. We're trying to gather with intent. We're trying to gather regionally. But how do we make sure that each one of our values live through our partners, our volunteers, our extended network? I think that certainly is one of the key challenges. But I would say on the opposite side too, because it's easy to worry about that, you always have kind of the feel of pulling off. But one of the other fear is, how do you know if you're striving enough? How do you know if you're actually setting your organization to reach its full potential? Or are you actually setting limits for yourself? And I think that's also another one that always keeps me up at night, right? And what's that saying? If we're on the quotes today, it's Maslow, right? That's saying that you always you have to grow again and again, and you have to overcome fear again and again, and that's so true in the work that we do.
I would like to share with you a very specific issue for public administration scaling or growing or being more impactful. Catherine mentioned you have to keep your agility. The unfortunate thing, for those who work in public administration, probably they know about, is that there are forces which are external to you that have delivered, especially in Western society, an incredible growth of the back office side of the story, especially if you manage money. So these programs, like the one that I managed, but many others, they strive to survive within a straitjacket which is growing every other day, where you have to spend more than half of your time to justify your existence in formal terms, not in impact terms. So how do you survive in this harsh environment? I think one of the elements is having a sense of history. So keeping alive the raison d'être that gave birth to that program, and also the good practices that led to possibly the success and the growth of that program until this moment where you have to talk with legals, auditors, financial controllers, and all these kind of things. And abuse in a certain way the sense of ownership of the program from the outsiders of the management entity, of the governance part. Again, for example, in my specific case, the European Parliament was the institution that gave birth to the program. even though they do not manage, they were the one in the 90s that decided we need a program like that. So keeping, reminding the new generations of MEPs that they are the moms and dads of that program seems to be anodyne, but it's very important. And again, you have to walk a little bit out of the given path. The other thing is your constituency. In our case, the beneficiaries, the recipient of the grants. Mobilizing those people via sometimes very personal contacts is fundamental, because if they don't sense that there is a problem on the other side, that the machine that they so much like might be sort of slowing down or becoming less effective, they might not be able to react. And we also have another issue, which is timing. In our kind of work in public administration, we live by cycles. So there is a time given when the new financial perspective, or the budget, if you want, are decided. If you are not on time with that kind of moment, you lose the train and you will have to wait maybe 7 years after before the train arrives again. So it's, as you can see, scaling up, it's really could be a dramatically different kind of perception when if you work in one place or another. I'm not saying that these poor guys in NCC or other institutions, they don't have administration. I'm sure they have.
Yeah, we have staff who could verify that. So maybe I'll just turn to the audience to see if on what we've heard so far, has anything that has been said here kind of sparked a question for you, or something you'd like to explore with the panel?
Who's first? Okay. Oh, I think there's.
Thank you. Cameron Mackwell, I've had that Canada. And thank you very much for great presentations. I guess my question really aims at whether scaling up is enough. One of the things that I would say, even though I got habitat in the name of my organization, land conservation on its own is not going to cut it in terms of ensuring a healthy planet for future generations. It requires integrating with all of the efforts that we're making in other areas, whether it be invasive species, whether it be in climate change, whether it be in One Health, whether it be in the number of areas that are really required to work together on. So it's one thing for us to scale up, and I realize this is a land conservation piece, but how do we actually work across from land conservation to the other efforts that are being made on for making the planet a better place?
From a public perspective first?
From a public perspective, I can report to you one particular tool that we designed to reply at least partially to that question. We were working, as I told you, brick by brick, so every single project was a new brick in the foundation of the big house. But at a certain point in time, we said, no, we have to accelerate the process. And to accelerate the process, we designed in the policy programming tools that countries, member states of the European Union, had to develop and adopt. And then we stepped in with the program, the financial program, and we said, okay, now we give you money to fully implement those programs. So you think about, I don't know, Quebec, that has a program, and somebody steps in and says, okay, this is the money I chip in, now you implement the program. The program obviously covers all those aspects. For the whole network you are responsible for, the part of the network. And at the beginning we were a bit hesitating, will it work or not? In reality it worked very well, and we also obliged those people to pull in strings from other financial resources, because we did not have the budget to really support in full the implementation of those programs from our program. And we have cases of our budget for a single project like that was, say, 20-30 million euro, and they were pulling in up to 4 billion euros from other sources of money. So it was very varied, but it's a successful scheme that we call the integrated projects. That's one.
And thank you for the question. I love it. And I think it's a good reminder of mindset. I think the conservation community's come a long way to integrate more, to look at beyond species. We've talked about the human aspect of it. And I think we've been very intentional in trying to make space at the conservation table to bring other partners to our table. I think what we're not doing enough is us going to other people's table. And I'll give you just a practical example. It's an interesting one. I see Claire in the room that works with us. But last year we were in Quebec in the conservation forum. I don't know, 400 people talking about connectivity. We all love what we do and we feel so proud about it. It's great work, amazing work. But on the next floor was the Mining Association of Quebec meeting there. Of course, none of us were there because we're talking to each other downstairs, right? And that's a good example of where this community needs to reach out, is to find spaces in other networks and really act like as an enabling partner. How can we help them achieve their objectives?
Yeah, again, thanks for the question. I think the banner of land conservation is not enough to be compelling anymore. Maybe it never was. And it's also inaccurate because when you really look at holistically what land conservation achieves, it is biodiversity, of course, it is saving natural areas, but there are health benefits to species and to people. There are educational benefits for species and people. There are economic benefits. And so it's important that we learn and listen to the full range of benefits that saving nature can provide and add that to our narrative and our vision so that it is more honest, more comprehensive, and more compelling.
Yeah, so looking at this from maybe a couple different angles, I think one of the big positive changes in conservation the last 5 years or so has really been the full integration of conservation and climate and bringing, you know, kind of that whole planetary lens to land conservation, ecosystem conservation. I was at New York Climate Week a few weeks ago with a lot of our African partner organizations. We helped them come to bring kind of the voices of African community-led conservation leaders to that space and, you know, articulate landscape scale, community-driven conservation as a core climate solution, which is fortunately now, I think, an argument that has been made, you know. Indigenous-led conservation, the centrality of Indigenous and community-based conservation from a global climate mitigation and carbon emission standpoint, that has really been taken up. People were making that case for a long time, and in the last 5 years, we've kind of seen the narrative and shift, and that's a lot of, you know, what we've seen in those global spaces. The flip side of that is as we have those kind of that integration, these opportunities to move out of silos and, you know, look at that kind of the whole system that we're situated within and take advantage of real opportunities to bring together different interests and different sources of expertise and new opportunities for funding, for sure. You know, again, a lot of the unprecedented funding flowing into conservation and landscape conservation now is from climate funding and is from that wider context. At the same time, I think one has to focus, again, on what every organization can do, right? There's a temptation, maybe as Greg alluded to you know, to be not too holistic in one's worth, right? We do a lot of strategic planning with our partners and really, again, trying to get them to focus on, okay, what are you really trying to change? What matters to you? What does the world need? And what do you bring? What is every organization, every effort uniquely positioned to deliver that will bring impact? And, you know, the big changes that we need come from the scaling up of those many, many, you know, site-based or community-based efforts that build up into something much larger and that, you know, are connected by this and many other networks of actors.
Maybe we can take one more question from the floor. I think, Stephen, did you have your hand up back there?
I did, but Cameron just asked it.
Oh, did he? Oh, very good. Okay. Yeah, Guy?
Thanks. Those were great presentations, great comments. My name is Guy Greenaway. I'm with the Corvus Center for Conservation Policy. And a question I have for all of the panelists are sort of a reflection on one of the dynamics that we often see around scaling within a network. Our organization will, in many cases, be part of a network where we're playing the leading role or we're playing the coordinating role. And this happened to me just recently, and an entity came to me and said, "Oh, you guys are conserving all of this land." And it's like, I'm not. I'm helping all of these other guys, but they're the ones who are doing the work. And I think that when you're in that sort of leading from beside position, trying to make sure that the credit arises to the right places, and that their ability to scale themselves independently, notwithstanding what you said, it was great that, you know, some should scale, some shouldn't scale. That's very true. But we've seen instances where it then switches to be feeding the network beast instead of trying to actually do their own work. So I'm just curious, any reflections on how you guys have managed that dynamic within your work?
First of all, I fully empathize with your question because I think many funders are so interested in results that they are not sophisticated enough to see that they're scaling a movement. And by investing in a movement and investing in collaboratives, which sounds kind of soft and fuzzy, they will actually get to bigger results than investing in just one organization. Not that every organization doesn't need investment as well. My thoughts are we have to become more aware of what it means to scale collaborative work, bring that to the attention of funders in terms of its impacts and its real results, understand that trust and relationships are fundamental to results, and get decision makers and policy makers and governments to understand that that is an important place of investment. In my own experience, we ran a collaborative conservation effort that we launched in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our funder was insightful enough to require us to do a 4-year study with independent evaluators on what made that work successful. And the result was a complete study looking at how to scale up collaboratives. That went throughout the state of California. And now there are collaborative conservation efforts in every area of California because one study showed how it could be done and proved the results. And I'm happy if anybody's interested in that study, I'll send you where to get it. But it does show that philanthropist investing into that networking work ended up producing results far beyond what they ever could have imagined. It had a statewide effect.
Yeah, I think Greg and Catherine have said it well, but it bears emphasizing that particularly because conservation is always, at some level, place-based and multidisciplinary, scaling always means scaling through partnerships, right? Through other organizations, not just through growth. And again, to bring that growth element. So the organizational structures and relationships, networks, partnerships that bring different actors together are critical. I think we can't really talk about scaling conservation or transformative efforts in conservation without being really focused on partnerships, collaboration, networks of actors, and how do you get those really delivering? And I think we also have to recognize in that context that, first of all, collaborations and partnerships are hard. They're easy to talk about, but they are really hard work because they involve lots of different actors with lots of different interests. They involve investments. They're often very hard because of the transaction costs involved in them to sell to funders, to make the case. The impact is more attenuated. So I think, for example, in our experience, national network organizations, of which we work with quite a few in Kenya and Namibia and Mozambique, Tanzania, they are critical, but they're often the hardest to mobilize resources for but they are central to these scaling questions. Because they bring together all the site-based actors, and often they are the ones that bring them together in the political coalitions that can really influence governance, which in Africa and everywhere is central to communities and landowners having rights over their lands and resources and really being able to deliver conservation in that context. So I think we've got to, in conservation, you know, really focus on the skills, the resourcing of developing those kinds of collaborations, partnerships, networks well, and a lot of the probably organizational patterns that we have had in conservation of maybe being territorial, maybe being too inwardly focused on our own organizations or our own resources or our own cause have often worked against that.
So that spurs a question for me. So we've talked about the need to have partnerships if we're going to scale. Have you ever been looked at a partnership or someone has invited you into one and you looked at it and you said, no, this isn't for me? And can you tell us why?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. The Norwegian fund, which is based on the excess credits that they get out of the oil that they extract in the North Sea, approached us as European Commission, I think in the year 2000. They said, well, we don't really have a mechanism to spend this money for biodiversity and climate change. Would you mind piling it up with your LIFE program and managing it as a whole? And that's where unfortunately, some of the worst elements of being a public administration come out. Because a public administration is like a sort of a big stone in the middle of the desert that doesn't want to interact with the sand that is around. It's built to be self-referential, has its own rule of existence, it's genetic and so on. So it's scary to manage something which is of another origin than yours, and is not regulated by rules that you know well. So we said no, and I must admit that we lost a big opportunity, because then the Norwegian fund continued to finance exactly for Natura 2000 the same thing we were financing under LIFE for years, but it was diluted in the hands of the countries, the member states, who did spend this the way they wanted. So a lot of the potential synergies that could have existed between the two amounts of money were lost, but okay.
Yeah, I was telling a story to a colleague at dinner last night about a case such as that, where we said no and gave some rather strong feedback to a partnership proposal that was very aligned with what we care about and what we work towards as an organization. But again, I think often the challenge is, and was in this case, that people are not willing to put in the work to actually build the foundations of trust, of bringing together different interests, rather than kind of dropping a partnership, which isn't really a partnership, which is, here's what I want to do, I want you to support it or put your logo on it or sign up to it or whatever. But really being willing to do the work to get actors on board. I mean, that's what you have to do. So if one isn't going to be serious about it and doesn't really want a partnership, but really wants something that kind of they've drawn up. And, you know, again, I think a lot of the time where things go wrong is either because the partnership is rushed and it doesn't take the time and really come from that place of inclusion. And certainly you see that a lot in terms of efforts to develop partnerships with community-based organizations, indigenous-led organizations. I'm sure there's tons of experience of failed partnerships in Canada and many other places because of the willingness to really invest in the cultivation and the development of a strong partnership, which takes a ton of time and effort.
Maybe I'll add, of course, I think beyond willingness, we've talked about the importance of being very clear and intentional about scaling and what outcome are you trying to produce and how are you producing these impact. And for me, it always comes back to this sort of magical trio of purpose, ambition, and culture or values, right? And being very clear about that. And as you know that, you will encounter partners where it's just not a good fit, or it's not right, or it may actually be a good fit, but growing in the right direction means making choices. what you say yes to and what you say no to. So you may have things that are aligned, but you may not have the capacity. It may not be the scale that you need. It may not be the right timing. And I think that's 100% right to say no. Like, partnership is not a goal in itself. Partnership is the way of organization and people coming together to produce results.
She said everything I was going to say. But anyway, I think, you know, it's worth being a little bit suspect of the partnership that is a photo op, or the partnership that's just a logo salad, I call it, you know, where all the logos are arrayed, but there's really not anything happening beneath the logos in the PowerPoint.
So maybe I'll turn back to the audience. Any other questions now that has come up? Yeah, Tony?
Tui Rogers, really just arm candy here for Laura Johnson. But one of the things, I was a management consultant for 10 years, and then I became a teacher. And I really do kind of believe that for all gatherings and relationships, what you see, you really start by seeing what happens in the playground for kindergartners. And going forward, and we've been hearing things about, you know, fear and relationships, and this whole meeting has been about relationships, building relationships. I'm more tactical, so I'm curious at the beginning, have you used, when you get to these, we should scale up, we shouldn't scale up, do you use outside consultants? Do you use, quote, sort of organizational therapists to come in, or mediators to come in and help you make that next step? I'm just wondering what experience you've had with that. Angela's looking.
Well, I mean, that's, for Maliasili, that's a lot of what we do, right? That's kind of our focus, which again, wasn't where I came from professionally. I was, you know, practitioner and working on conservation and working in building partnerships and collaborations. But we came to this realization that, okay, the way that we can really support and strengthen and grow African conservation champions and shift more agency and resources to the African organizations, which, you know, in a context where international organizations have historically dominated, was by focusing on that organizational lens. And so, you know, I think, like, we run leadership programs, and we talk a lot about collaboration and get tactical around, like, building trust. Like, how does one build trust? How do you actually build those relationships? How do we invest in them? How do we create spaces at gatherings like this that foster, you know, we talk a lot about intimacy, and strategic intimate balance was something actually that a consultant we worked with on our first leadership program introduced to us. And again, a reason why a lot of collaborations fail is because they go to that strategic side. Hey, here's the work we want to do together. Let's go. This is what we want to do, without building the intimacy of the relationships that actually allow human beings to interact productively and work well together. So in thinking about whenever people are coming together, whether it's 5 people or whether it's 200, how are you creating a space physically, emotionally, intellectually, to actually get the best out of people connecting as human beings, to be able to then collaborate and work well together, whether that's a team or whether that's, you know, a much more diverse or larger group.
Yeah, I sometimes think we need Conservationist Anonymous, where you say, I am a conservationist and I need help. And I've often thought if someone opened a conservation therapy business, you'd do really well. So some entrepreneur out there might do that. But what I'm seeing that makes me hopeful is more and more, particularly in the collaborative work, well, Deb's an example here, there's attention to the soft skills that are needed to be a leader today. It's no longer about competitive leadership, it's about collaborative leadership. And they operate on fundamentally different principles of leadership. And for many people, it's frightening because you are letting go of power to a degree. You have to, and that's scary. You're running your organization that you're asked to yield. So, you know, I really believe in cohort groups, because if the relationships are good, they serve as a therapy session where people can explain their fears or their challenges in a safe space and find people that not only empathize, but maybe have been there before and know and can help them advance. So we really need to support one another, not only at the impact side, but at the, as Catherine said, at the courage and at the emotional side, I guess I would say.
And maybe I'll add to that is I strongly recommend that everybody has its consultant, advisors, friends, mentor, guides completely outside of our sectors. And whether it's formally through boards, through consultant, I think that's just really important to just challenge the perspective at all time and not just at the highest level of the organization, at all level of the organization. That's how we grow, right? So.
There is one word that was said before, empathy, and I think, well, the first thing is that, again, in the public administration, my last sober message on that, and then I'll move to positives. We are bound to have consultants that from outside tell you how well you have been working, how badly you have been working, and what you should do next. You pay them, so they are not independent, and usually they say what you want that they say. Or what somebody else wants that they say. But this particular aspect of consultancy, I would not take it as a sort of a best practice, if you want. But in terms of empathy, one success story that I have learned from this program is we were donors, so we're just money givers, if you want. We could be a bank or anybody else. In reality, we played the role of real partners. So we always claimed, and we practiced it, that we were partners in those projects. So we did not dig the ground, but we showed them physically, with our physical presence by way of visiting the projects several times, almost every year in certain situations, and by sharing their success or crying for their failures, we showed them that we were really behind them. Why? Because each of those projects served our policy goals. So we thought you were, so it was not designed as such, they were not partners, like in the mechanism that were just described, but we felt that they were each individually one of our partners. And this was so much successful that it helped developing a sort of sense of ownership of the program and pertaining to the program. The first meeting we had in Brussels in, I don't even remember, 95, I think, we were thinking we were going to welcome a couple of hundred people participating to what we call the Life Week. In reality, more than 700 showed up. So, and for us, it was a very telling thing, because we saw that these people, they felt like being part of an elite club. We are the one that won those projects, European projects and blah, blah, blah. So I think this kind of elements, which are really subtle, they become, at the end of the day, the strongest element in the foundation of a success and possibly of a scaling up of a mechanism.
So, you know, when we see the success of many of the groups that you saw on the slides, you know, you can kind of think about being smaller and then scaling up. But if you've ever tried to do something new, you're not a Olympian, you know, the first time you pick up the paddle or whatever. So I think about growing and scaling. It's not always, or maybe ever, a linear trajectory. So maybe you could give us your perspectives on what that trajectory of growth looks like when you are trying to scale. Who wants to try? You want to try?
Again, me, again, sorry if I explain things by anecdotes. You remember the integrated projects before. 2004, something like that, we developed this concept. I prepared a very nice PowerPoint presentation. We go to our hierarchy because in our scheme, that's the way it works. We presented and we said that's in the next edition of the LIFE program, we would have this kind of tool in place. So a sort of a non-linear scaling up of the program. My Director General says, no, Angelo, thanks a lot, but this is not for us. It's the member states who have to do it, so goodbye. So I put the thing in my drawer. 10 years after, I become the head of unit of that particular department. And obviously the Director General has gone somewhere else. I have completely different hierarchy. And again, the question is, what do we do next in the next round of the LIFE program? I open the drawer. I manipulate a little bit the PowerPoint presentation. I go to my Director General at the time. Oh, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. And the president of the commission himself said that it was one of the best innovation in that financial perspective that were adopted. So stamina, survival, because you have to survive in your position, and indeed think that everything is not linear, and every now and then, all of a sudden, you play the lottery and your ticket wins. So that's another recipe.
Yeah, I always tell people that for Maliasili, I think one of the most important things for us has been that we didn't know what we were going to do when we started. Like, that was really important. Like, we knew what we wanted to do, but we didn't know what we were going to do, like how we were going to do it. We knew what the goal was. Okay, we want to help strengthen and grow these great African organizations. We want to be helpful, but the whole way of working has been a constant iteration. You know, we discovered that strategic planning was really important because we saw that organizations had a funding challenge. Well, why don't you have the money you need? Are you communicating about your great work? Well, you're not communicating about it. Okay, communications is important. And if you're going to communicate about what you want to achieve so you can get funding, okay, well, that's why you need a strategy, right? We started doing leadership programs because we realized we needed to focus on the leaders, not just on the organization, that the individuals have a disproportionate impact. So everything has been kind of iterative in terms of, okay, what's the next piece that we can tackle that will enable us to be more effective? And I think a key in that is always your feedback loops, right? What do you do? And that's, you know, partly the focus on impact. What are you doing? What's the impact it's having? What are you learning from it? We're in a period of growth right now. You know, we've had internal change, which is often the most complex thing to manage. As you're growing, the relationships between people are changing. How you invest in managing that, how you invest in maintaining your culture, but constantly getting feedback. Asking your team, asking your partners, how are we doing? What's the result? It's those feedback loops that I think enable you to adapt quickly internally and in terms of your external relationships to enable things to externally look like they're going quite smoothly, but internally, in reality, it's a constant process of adaptation and refinement and learning from what it is that you're doing.
I laugh because it's so true, but at NCC, we often talk, we're in the business of forever, right? So when we're thinking about growth, it's really important to think about the sustainability of it. It's not what you'll achieve in 2 years, but how can you sustain it over the long run? And it's true, we always look to see those curves. When we look back, they look great, but really, they're just like that, right? It's a constant, you know, pedal on the gas, foot on the brake. And I think it's okay. You have to embrace this. Growth is learning, right? Nobody gets it perfect. And sometimes you do have to slow down because some of the process in any organization, some of them are just not scalable, right? You get to the end of it. And in order to reach that next plateau, you need to actually build a new system. You need to change the financial system. You need to hire new people. You need to stop doing something so you could do something else. And I think that sort of humbleness and openness is really, really important. If you want to keep the pace of change manageable for everybody and you want to keep your eyes on the long-term goal.
Yeah. Once again, couldn't agree more. You know, the one thing I think that I had to learn is because we're all so programmatically driven, we're impact driven, and you can grow your organization to a certain level and then suddenly realize you haven't invested into the organizational infrastructure. And because you haven't, because you're putting all your money in impact, you can't get to that next stage because the infrastructure is not there to support it. So that tends to be when you have a little dip, and it tends to be, as Catherine said, when you can reevaluate where you're headed and if it's the right direction. For me, I need to keep things simple to have a way to move forward. And so at the Conservancy, we developed this way of constantly looking at our work: vision, resources, and execution. The first one was we had to keep our vision compelling. That was important. That meant sometimes we moderated our vision because we had learned things that made it more effective. But we also knew a vision without resources was a hallucination. So we couldn't live in the hallucinatory world. We had to resource the vision to get something done. So, and then the resources, as we've all talked about here, they're not necessarily financial resources. They may be partnership resources or political resources or volunteer resources that get you to the next step. And then if you have the resources, execution becomes important because those resources are precious. And execution, good execution requires a good toolbox, and a good toolbox produces great results. So it's like I just always kept those three things in my mind at each stage of our growth at the Conservancy.
Just occurred to me, why we are all here is a great example of origination and scaling up. And I think, Lisa, for you and Angelo, and I think for John and maybe some others, ILCN started 10 years ago out of really nothing. It was a new idea. It was an idea hadn't been tried before. I know when Laura was planning that first meeting in Providence, she's going, holy cow, we're going to have people. She'd interviewed you, and John, I think she'd interviewed you, I believe, and Angelo and many other people. She said, people from all over the world are going to be there. How are we going to do this? How are we going to get them together? And she did bring in, maybe you remember Jay Vogt, who mediated all of that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the beginnings of ILCN, where we are all here today for.
I wasn't expecting to be a part of the panel. Yeah, I mean, I think the ILCN is a perfect example of a bunch of already existing networks, because these people all came from places that had ideas and a vision and resources, but knew to scale. None of them could do it alone, and understood, Jim and Laura particularly understood right away the power of the collective. And so thinking about collective impact, those early days, again, I don't think we totally knew where it was going or if it was even going to work. But a little bit of a leap of faith there, but saying there was enough passion and interest, let's see where it can go. And I think it has evolved over time. It has changed a little bit, it has expanded. And we've really thought a lot about how do we continue to open the tent. So even though we are private and civic, you can see even in this Congress, we're thinking about how do the other relationships, whether it's public, whether it's Indigenous or other sectors, how are they going to be integrated into the ecosystem in which we're working? So for me, it's been 10 years, but it's actually a super exciting period because I can see going forward as we are all becoming more integrated with climate, with biodiversity, that there is space for more people at the table, and there is more space for new ideas to do things differently. I think the finance sessions here, if you've been to them, I mean, 15 years ago, we would not have had global, financiers in the room with us. So I think it is, it's enabling relationships that I think you might not have even thought of 10 years ago. And perhaps I look forward to thinking about who will be in the relationship 10 years from now that we never thought about today. So that's kind of fun. But this is not about me. So let me close the panel with maybe an unfair question. But you've all been very successful. You're at this Congress for 2 days. You I'm sure have new ideas from being here. What are you going to do differently after having been here and talking and learning with the people you've been with when you go back home?
Presuming I could do something. So from my little angle of a normal citizen now, it's obviously very difficult to imagine immediately a follow-up from the results of this meeting. But I already started, so I contacted my former colleagues. I told them that I learned about a very interesting mechanism where philanthropic world, public administration and so on, they work together at a very large scale. And I told them that whether they would like to be part of a virtual video conference where those people could explain, like they did here greatly, the scheme. Will it fly? Will it not? I'm not anymore in decision making, so it's up to them, but I can still influence them. I can still lobby them. And this is one of the things I've learned working in Brussels, that lobbying can be done by individuals, by groups, and so on. So the other things I retain from here is that what has driven me in ILCN and has kept me running for the last 10 years is curiosity and ignorance. So the two compile together. You come here curious, you learn and you reinforce your feeling that you were ignorant, and you're just ignorant also when you leave, but a little bit less. And the other C is courage. So once you are curious and you pick up something new, you should have the courage to see whether it could be useful for you, or could be used and turn it possibly into something tangible quite rapidly, and not in the next 25 years.
Yeah, being maybe on kind of a practical level, and Lisa, you kind of alluded to it, something I've been thinking a lot about is, and relates to the session that just preceded us, is, you know, one of the big changes in conservation and one of the positive trends, and really important when we're talking about scale, is finance, right? And, you know, we're now in an era of these large landscape, national scale, long-term financing, and how to really get those to deliver for community level, small, you know, to connect those scales between the scale of finance that's being mobilized and those place-based and community-based efforts. There's a lot of innovation going on. It's exciting times for that. And how to do that better, that's just something that's really sitting with me, because connecting across those scales is going to be critical to all the money delivering the impact that we want.
I think for me, it's, I would say, renewed courage. You know, we talked about how it's easy to sort of ease off, and I think just being in the room with hearing the example from everywhere and seeing everything that's been done certainly renews courage. That's for one. Another piece, which is a bit of a nugget for me, hasn't been so much about innovation or new things, but listening to the various tangible examples. It's actually taken a different lens for me on some of the things we're already doing, and thinking about, okay, we've always done this. How about we try this that way? And I think that's been really, really valuable, because you don't get a lot of time to do that. You know, I'll give you just a practical example. NCC has a revolving fund. We've had it for over 25 years. We fund it ourselves. I mean, as I'm sitting in all those financing, I'm like, why on earth are we doing this? Why am I not sitting with all those partners? That's a very small thing. It's been in our face all along, but I needed to be in that room to kind of go like, light bulb. And then I don't think I slept last night, because I kept thinking of everything I could be doing with that and all the partnership and everybody I could be sitting with, which I still need to refine it a bit before I do anything. After a good weekend, it'll be better. But that's the power of those conferences, right? It's the small nuggets, and I think it's going to continue to sink in for a while still.
Lisa, you use the term, when I go back home. Actually, I would rather not go back home. You may have heard there's a really odd election occurring in my home country, and I would like to be put in a coma for about 6 weeks until it's over. But the other piece is, because I do some work in Canada, and because my wife and son are dual citizens, it's such an honor to be here with all of you. This is such an amazing country, and what you believe and what you stand for and your conservation ethic. So I go back home really with more inspiration, more motivation, with more heartfelt connection to all the people here and around the globe that are doing the work that you all do. And that's just like wind in my sails, I guess. And I hope everyone else feels the same thing as we depart this wonderful Congress.
Just in case.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughts and you know, for your honesty and really your vulnerability to talk about some of the things that, you know, doesn't always work as we're trying to do this important work. So if you could join me in thanking our panelists. We're pretty close to being on time. There's a few minutes if you want to have a personal conversation, and of course you can always reach them on on their emails and their bios. So please feel free to have a conversation.